All right, we are back. It's great to see everybody this morning. Hello and welcome to Hear Me, See Me, the 2021 Equity in Missouri Higher Education Summit. If you are now joining us, I am Sarah Salmons, co-planner of the summit and today's MC. In just a few minutes, we will hear from our keynote speaker, Martha Snyder. Before we get started, a few conference etiquette reminders. All participants should stay muted to eliminate background noise. We want to see your faces, so if you have a camera, turn it on to better engage with us. All presentations will be live, so bear with us on any technical issues. The chat will be monitored for questions throughout the presentations. If you enter a session and decide it's not for you, please close out and head to a different session, just like you would at a normal conference, a normal in-person conference. All sessions will be recorded, so if you're not able to come to any of the sessions, you'll be able to access them later on our conference website. And don't forget to engage with us on social media throughout the day using hashtag Equity2021 and @MoDude and on our new conference website. I now have the pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker. Martha Snyder is an education policy specialist with high levels experience supporting federal and state policymakers. At HCM Strategist, she provides policy expertise and strategic counsel on a wide range of areas from finance and accountability to college readiness and affordability. Martha is a primary lead for Lumina Foundation Strategy Labs, where she provides nonpartisan expertise and facilitation on affordability, outcomes-based funding, and other finance policies to improve higher education attainment. She also serves as the key strategist on state post-secondary policy work for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. In addition to this work, Martha contributes to the post-secondary team on issues of aligning post-secondary financing to advance improved outcomes for underserved populations, transitioning between K through 12 and post-secondary education, and evaluating policies that support K through 12 and post-secondary student transitions. A believer in the link between higher education and economic success, Martha has worked both personally and professionally to improve education outcomes for disadvantaged students. While at Villanova University earning her bachelor's degree, Martha tutored inner-city students and witnessed the education system challenges that allowed many students to fall through the cracks. Martha later graduated from Syracuse University with a master's degree in public administration and, inspired by a graduate professor, pursued a career in education policy to help expand educational opportunities for students. Before her tenure at HCM Strategists, Martha worked as a senior policy advisor at the United States Department of Education, focusing on K through 12 accountability, high school reform, and special education. She also serves as an assistant director at the White House Domestic Policy Council, developing budget priorities and providing analysis and counsel on all federal education issues. Her legislative branch experience includes a stint as a legislative assistant to Representative Jim Gerlach of Pennsylvania. Martha lives with her husband and 4 children in Albany, New York, where she has put her passion for creative educational approaches to work on the board of directors for 2 local charter schools. A 13-time marathon finisher, which, Martha, I must say, you are my hero. That's amazing. Martha is an enthusiastic runner and a dedicated fan of the Buffalo Bills. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Martha Snyder.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah, for that kind introduction. I'm going to work on sharing my screen. Are you able to see my screen?
No, not yet.
Not sure what is happening. And we had
Okay.
just not letting me share.
Okay. That's weird.
Yeah.
Well, we will work that out. Bear with us just a second, folks, if you would.
Thank you, Sarah. Hey, sorry about that, everyone. Always good to have that disclaimer that Sarah provided at the very beginning. Technology issues are always a challenge in this day and age. But thank you again, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to present to you today. I first want to start with a thank you, a genuine thank you to Sarah, Sam, and Jessica and the full team for all their efforts in putting this critical event together. I think it's a critical conversation that's being elevated in Missouri. And first, just want to start off with a little bit of a kind of background. As I was presenting or preparing for this presentation the other night, my daughter asked me what it was all about. And having learned from experience, I knew anything more than a quick response would be met with some sort of glazed over look at best, or more likely the eye roll that she's perfected as she approaches her teen years. So I said that I was, getting the fact that getting a college degree is important, but not everyone has the same opportunity to go to college. So I'm talking about how states should make decisions that give more resources to those that need more support. She looked at me and said, that makes sense. But if only it were that simple. Because what I didn't tell her was these decisions are often entrenched in decades of politics and policy that make undoing them or adjusting them very difficult. That sometimes, really most of the time, we make decisions in service to certain institutions or constituencies. And those institutions and constituencies are the ones that are already seen and already heard. This morning, we are going to talk about the role post-secondary finance plays in student equity, specifically elevating some principles states could use to assess and guide more equitable budget decisions. But first, we're going to start with that all-important notion of context, getting equity in the current context. This may not be new information, and particularly for those at institutions, certainly this is the lived reality you are experiencing right now. And you probably will hear it several times over the next few days. But it is important as context establishes the parameters for policymaking. So here we go. Let's see what equity looks like in the current context. Could advance to the next slide. Thank you. So the pandemic, as we all know, has put equity, or rather inequity, on full display. We've seen it play out in a variety of indicators, from the health implications of the pandemic to the secondary economic and educational implications that the pandemic has caused. Looking at one indicator, unemployment, the trends were the same across all groups, but the impacts most pronounced for the Black population. And while we see unemployment improving, the gaps from pre-pandemic levels remain greatest for Black and Latino populations. Next slide. We also know unemployment is heavily influenced by levels of education. Individuals with higher levels of education are less affected by economic recessions generally. And this has been true in the pandemic. Those with more education, though impacted initially, have recovered more quickly. Next slide. And again, we know there are significant gaps in educational attainment. Black and Latino populations have lower educational attainment. So this becomes a self-reinforcing narrative. Those less well educated are more susceptible to economic downturns. Black and Latino populations have lower levels of educational attainment, so these populations suffer more when the economy slows. Because of the pandemic have made this even more pronounced, as the industries most affected by the pandemic are those that can't be done from the comfort of our own homes. Industries that employ higher numbers of people of color, low income, and less well-educated individuals. Next slide. And while recessions can sometimes be an opportunity for individuals to pursue further education and training, COVID is not a typical recession. It is, in fact, a health crisis with economic and educational implications. You see here the significant divergence from normal trends. Community college enrollment is usually counter-cyclical to unemployment. Enrollments go up when unemployment goes up. But this is very much not the case during COVID. And we know the declines in enrollment have also been inequitable. All of this plays into the K-shaped recovery we're experiencing and reading about in the news. Those that fared better prior to the pandemic are faring better as we recover. Those that were inequitably participating in the economic fortunes prior to the pandemic are facing greater barriers. Next slide. Health implications, unemployment, digital divide, enrollment declines, the social and racial unrest, all point to the equity challenges that face our nation. And certainly post-secondary can play a critical role in overcoming the many challenges of the past 18 months. But states must tackle these challenges in a strategic way, understanding that the economic imperative has equity at its center. Next slide. So certainly the pandemic did not create the inequities in post-secondary opportunity and economic participation that we see, but it did magnify them. Without a systemic shift that fundamentally transforms the higher education financing system, the economic downturn risks further widening these gaps between those who can productively and sustainably participate in the economy and the workforce and those that can't. Next slide, please. And I was really pleased to hear Commissioner Mulligan talk about the role of finance and budget in the state, and that it is a critical lever that the state has to advance policy and strategy. And simply put, budgets are value statements. As Commissioner Mulligan again noted, this is one of the key levers that the department has to advance policy and influence outcomes. How states invest their resources is clearly a reflection of values and priorities, and equity cannot be a value in name only, it must be reflected in practice. Next slide. So a little bit of context in terms of trends looking at the national level, and certainly, I'm sure many of these trends are relevant to the specific context of Missouri. So despite increases since the Great Recession, state funding per FTE is lower than it was 20 years ago, despite a more diverse, more needy population. This means students bear a larger share of the costs, and it doesn't take too much extrapolation to understand that this has serious implications for equity. Next slide. And when we break this down just a little bit further, we see even more concerning metrics. Again, this is looking at national data, but the reality is that many state budgets don't reflect an equity value, with not only higher levels of total resources going to institutions that serve fewer students of color, but higher levels of state and local support. And when you break this down to even more granular levels, particularly within the four-year sector, you see even more concerning trends. Next slide. Flipping the lens to how we support students, and things look a little bit better, sort of. Approximately 75% of financial aid across the nation is directed towards students with need. Again, Commissioner Mulligan referenced this in the context of Missouri. And during COVID, this has actually emerged as a trending priority for states to protect and even expand need-based financial aid. However, there remains significant variability across states, and the increases in financial aid have not kept up with the increases in tuition, lowering their purchase power and making need even more great. Next slide. Again, an issue also referenced by Commissioner Mulligan. For many, tuition is only one piece of the cost to go to college. Meeting basic needs such as health, housing, food, transportation is a concern. And these concerns were heightened again by the pandemic with the added element of access to broadband, digital curriculum, hampering access to online and remote learning. These factors, again, have pernicious impacts for populations of color and low-income populations, as well as those in rural communities. Next slide. Just a brief moment on the kind of the impacts of this as it relates to overall financing of education, and a concerning trend, again, that we see when you break it down by race and ethnicity. But the combination of decreased state support, increasing tuition not met by increases or equitable increases, equal increases in need-based aid awards that leave students with unmet need, again, results in students having to borrow to finance their undergraduate education. And while student debt in and of itself isn't a bad thing, the reality is there are once again significant disparate implications of borrowing, most notably again for Black borrowers. More Black bachelor's degree holders have to borrow to finance their education and have to borrow significantly more. Black students come from lower income families, are more likely to attend for-profit institutions due to the recruitment practice of these institutions, and take longer to complete due to enrollment intensity and other life factors that prevent them from enrolling full-time. Additionally, once students take out this debt, they are more likely to struggle to pay off their loans. This is oftentimes related to the value of the degree that they receive and other employment opportunities that they may or may not have. Again, this reflects a cycle of inequities across the educational system. Next slide. So how can states more effectively target post-secondary investments to support more equitable opportunity and outcomes? Well, the answer is fairly simple, through a more strategic, targeted, and equity budget policies. Again, Commissioner Mulligan referenced many of these in her opening remarks as a critical lever that the department has in advancing more equitable opportunities. Next slide, please. So in response to the implications of COVID, we HCM, the development of a document published by Lumina Foundation and Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that lays out principles for how states can make strategic budget decisions. While this was developed in the immediate context of COVID, the principles are meant to be applied to any fiscal circumstance, be it to navigate fiscal challenges or to make determinations about how to invest new money, including the new federal money that many states have received. The principles have equity at their center. I'm going to zero in on the 3 principles highlighted here as they serve as the foundation for the other 2, which is really about expanding resources to invest differently, using the principles 1 through 3, and evaluating ways to improve the system and institutional cost structures, again, to be reinvested in ways that align with principles 1 through 3. Next slide. The first principle focuses on how states fund institutions and recognizing again that earlier slide that was referenced around the inequities that have built up over time, particularly for institutions that serve higher numbers of the most affected populations, those that had less access to higher education or post-secondary opportunities prior to the pandemic, and those that continue to have less access. Again, we've already referenced many of them, those populations being Black, Latino, Native American, low-income students, and rural communities, or individuals in rural communities. In many cases, the institutions serving the most vulnerable populations also have less diverse and less flexible revenue streams, meaning they are more reliant on state resources to fill in gaps. And particularly in the face of the declining enrollments referenced earlier among the most critical and vulnerable populations, and at the institutions that often serve as their entry points to education and training, states should assess how to ensure these institutions remain viable in the short term and student ready in the long term. States should first and foremost avoid across the board approaches and instead implement longer term solutions that create equitable, accessible, affordable paths to post-secondary credentials that provide upward economic mobility for the most vulnerable populations. So much of our finance system is built on costs, but those costs often being faculty salaries and other factors of inputs. And while these metrics are certainly okay to be considered in how states fund or at what level states fund different institutions, they should be only one factor that determines the allocation of resources. We also need to build in student-centered factors that account for and fund differing student needs. to ensure institutions have adequate resources or closer to adequate resources to provide support services and programs that have advanced successful access and outcomes for more vulnerable, more needy populations. Next slide. The second principle focuses on how states can more directly and equitably support students. Again, getting to that need-based component and some of those other components that we referenced in terms of cost beyond tuition. States should minimally maintain, if not expand, investments in need-based aid. And for those states that have merit-based programs, should either redirect those resources or at least add in need-based components to ensure the neediest students receive the support they need. States should also assess the design of their need-based aid programs to remove barriers to access and ensure a broader assessment of unmet need, inclusive of costs beyond tuition. Again, transportation, childcare, broadband, technology. Spending a moment on some of these eligibility requirements, oftentimes even need-based aid programs have eligibility requirements built within them that ultimately limit access to certain populations, such as requirements of full-time enrollment, recognizing that adult students and other students oftentimes cannot afford to attend full-time, so they do not have access to those need-based resources. Age is one other barrier, common barrier built within these need-based aid programs, often reflected as a requirement for states to graduate high school and immediately enroll in a post-secondary program. Again, obviously that limits access to who receives financial aid, and I think is particularly an issue as we see the implications of COVID-19, on enrollment. Also, time since high school graduation, as I referenced, all of these can have negative and inequitable implications on students. Finally, during the last decade, and sorry, the title on this is actually incorrect. This is about funding students. Next slide, please. This principle 3, apologies for that, I had fixed it in my slides, is about supporting students or supporting successful student engagement and intervention strategies. So those programs and needed interventions that we know have had success with advancing both access and success of underserved populations. And really during the last decade, as we all know, and again, Commissioner Mulligan referenced many of these in her opening remarks, but faculty, college leaders, systems, and states have focused on what it takes for students to complete the credentials they start, and to do so in a timely way and thus enter or re-enter the workforce more quickly. States should continue to invest in effective evidence-based practices, dropping what isn't working and supporting institutions that are already serving students well. A couple of different strategies states have embraced to advance these types of reforms include a broader outcomes-based or student success funded appropriation, having some portion of states' resources, not just on ensuring access of underserved populations, but also the success of those populations. Again, something that Commissioner Mulligan referenced has been something that the state has been pursuing for some time now. Well-designed student success funding models that encourage progression and completion and prioritize these outcomes for underserved populations have been shown to support the scaling of student success strategies at institutions. A couple of examples to point to include Oregon's 4-year sector allocation model, which has equity at its center, and Ohio's community college funding model, which again has equity at its center. The other strategies include more direct funding of accelerated career pathway programs and integrate wraparound services. Again, we know that these programs have high upfront costs from a lot of the research done around the CUNY ASAP program, but certainly have a high return on investment in terms of significant improved outcomes for students. And then certainly expanding funding to high quality workforce aligned credential programs, something that has been a focus of Missouri over the past several years, and something that other states such as Virginia and its Fast Forward program have invested in to provide training for jobs in high demand fields. Next slide. So finally, as I approach concluding, I just want to kind of circle back in terms of these principles that I walked through, again, referencing 2 additional that are really meant to expand the scope of resources and use resources more effectively to be reinvested in principles 1 through 3, are meant to advance more equitable participation and success in post-secondary education. But as I close, I also want to point out that post-secondary education, again, can play a critical role in addressing these inequities. But inequities start long before an individual's post-secondary career and become a self-reinforcing condition. Strategies targeted toward addressing inequities in post-secondary access and success are important, but simply insufficient. In reality, a broader, multi-pronged, multi-agency, cross-sector, and cross-stakeholder approach that includes but extends beyond post-secondary education is the only way equity can be achieved and sustained. Without these efforts, those that are not seen will remain unseen, and those that are not heard will remain unheard. Thank you again for your time this morning, and I'm now happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much to Martha Snyder for your inspiring remarks. And like she said, we want to give folks a couple minutes to ask whatever questions you may have through the chat, and we'll have a brief Q&A session.
All right, Sam, we have a question in the chat if you want to ask.
Alrighty. See, to your point about supporting institutions enrolling significant numbers of BIPOC students, do you have some examples to share of how some states are doing this in partnership with HBCUs and or other community colleges?
Yeah, so I would say I think the state that has kind of taken the lead on really embracing an equity-centered finance and fiscal agenda, and really an equity-centered state policy approach is Virginia. And there's a whole history there. I won't go into it in terms of their equity focus that filters beyond just education. But as it relates to education, they have taken steps and are currently in the process of reviewing their finance model. To ensure that it is more equitably targeted to institutions that serve higher numbers of BIPOC populations. And part of that review includes obviously having institutions at the table, taking as I referenced earlier, certainly accounting for the costs of instruction, the costs of faculty salaries, et cetera, but really kind of taking a lens that also provides a student-centered focus or student-centered definition of cost. So recognizing that populations or institutions that serve higher numbers of these populations have higher support cost needs. And that is a very inclusive process that the state, again, is currently underway. I also referenced Oregon. Oregon is another state that has a history. They have an equity framework that has driven a lot of the the policy direction of the state. And within the four-year sector, they have very clear equity priorities reflected in their funding model. Though so not directly engaging or directly targeted towards HBCUs, as is the case in Virginia. So certainly we see states starting to go down this road. I think certainly in the community college sector is a much more direct way that states have started to engage that sector and build in, again, entry or access weights to their funding models, in some ways reflective of the philosophy that comes from the K-12 education, finance, and funding space.
We got a question asking which states, states plural, use resources effectively to provide access to technology and broadband.
So I don't know if I have a specific state in mind. I do think this is something that we've seen come out as a priority of the pandemic, and particularly how states have used federal resources is really to expand access to broadband and a lot of broadband initiatives. I think New Mexico is a state that had not just focused on post-secondary, but focused more broadly, obviously, on access to broadband in the rural communities within that state. Recognizing the implications are not just educational in terms of being able to access educational opportunities, but also economic in terms of being able to engage productively in the workforce.
I see. And we have another question asking for some clarification on the K trend in the graph you showed concerning community college enrollment during periods of unemployment or higher unemployment rates.
Absolutely. So yeah, so typically the community college enrollment runs countercyclical to the economy. So when the economy is strong, community college enrollments dip because you have more economic or workforce participation. When the economy slows down, you have students or individuals, excuse me, using that opportunity to pursue additional education, training opportunities. That has very much not been the case. I mean, one of the I think there was another report out this morning about the significant declines in enrollment, despite some of the economic implications of the pandemic. So you saw that trend diverge really strongly, and we have not seen a common or a counter cyclical enrollment in community colleges. And that community college enrollment, when you break it down by demographics, certainly we see stronger implications or more implications for populations of color, low-income students, those that would receive Pell that are not returning. And when you break that down even further, you see implications within those groups across sex or gender, with the male population particularly disengaging from additional education and training.
I see. We've got another comment I'd like to read. As college employees, we're at the mercy of state and national funding models. While we are aware of the inequities inherent in those models, we sometimes feel powerless to affect them. From our positions as higher education professionals, what is our role in helping to address these inequities? What can we do to support and advocate for meaningful changes in the state and national funding models?
So I'm one that believes data are very strong storytellers. And so certainly having access to data that illustrates these issues, that illustrates the inequities within your own system or even within your own institution. And then I think asking for a seat at the table, with policymakers, and being very, very clear that you are advocating or are coming on behalf of students and particularly on behalf of those individuals that do not have equitable access and opportunity to post-secondary. But really, I think it is the way we're going to shift it is, as this conference, I love the name of this conference, Hear Me, See Me. I think it is about elevating the voices that are not heard and not seen, and really being an echo chamber for them, being a microphone for them to be the face of post-secondary finance. I don't have a magical answer for how it will change other than data, information, engaging in the conversation, and being dedicated to being dedicated to the advocacy efforts that are required.
And then Sam, there was another question too that I don't know if you saw. It says, given racial and spatial, so African American and spatial rural Missouri disparities, how critical is equity in Missouri's scholarship program if data show these groups aren't receiving a fair share of these dollars?
I mean, I couldn't argue for them to be, that they're critical. And I think the fact that that is not an unusual trend in states, in terms of even within scholarship programs that might be need-based or might be broadly accessible. When you look at the data, again, data tell a very powerful story. You have inequitable access to who is receiving that. And there's a host of reasons for that, likely. But I think it is certainly a starting point, is to make sure that you recognize the critical nature of scholarships, of need-based aid, of opportunities to drive down costs, and start to address and understand why are there inequities in terms of who is accessing those. Is it something to do with the structure of the program? Is it something to do with the communication and the outreach to these students if they're rural populations, and targeting policies and strategies towards addressing those?
And we've got a comment from Ozarks Technical Community College regarding their decision to no longer hold academic transcripts for those owing a college balance, on the grounds that the data is not indicating that holding transcripts is increasing the likelihood of former students paying. Do you have any commentary about where you've seen perhaps this practice employed or other perhaps more student-friendly practices implemented?
So I don't have specific examples. I know colleagues on my team work on this more directly. That being said, I do also know that it is an increasing focus of the national dialogue, is the issue of transcripts and transcript withholding, and particularly, again, when you look at the implications of that from an equity perspective, it has very real equity implications. And I believe, even the U.S. Department of Ed has elevated this as an issue that they want to tackle, an issue that they want to at least understand if they can influence, making sure that those transcripts that students earn those credits, and taking the viewpoint that those belong to the individuals.
Sam, there was also another question. What are some ways states can most effectively leverage federal stimulus dollars and federal policy shifts?
So the federal stimulus dollars, not to sound too contrite, but or too simplistic, excuse me. I would certainly start with some of the principles that were elevated today, to the degree that you have the ability to influence how those resources are targeted. Doing so in a lens that filters through making sure that resources are going to provide critical access to those individuals that aren't accessing them. I did see a question in the chat in response to the kind of impact or the K-shaped enrollment trends that we're seeing in community colleges, and why. Certainly, it's because, one, this is a health crisis with economic and educational implications. But two, because of that, you have individuals that are at home trying to balance teaching their children or navigating the uncertainty of whether or not their children will be in school or not, and therefore are having limitations or barriers to access. So directing resources in that way, in ways that can address those barriers, again, through technology, broadband, childcare, et cetera. And then certainly the pathways, the pathways, again, that Commissioner Mulligan referenced, really understanding what are those pathways, those credential areas that provide high economic return for individuals, and targeting resources in ways that get individuals into those pathways, as well as, obviously completing those pathways.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again so much, Martha, for sharing your expertise and insights with us. We really appreciate you being here, joining us this morning. The time is 9:40 Central, and the breakout sessions will begin promptly at 9:50. So you've got a 10-minute break to grab some coffee, do what you need to do, and then join us for one of our fabulous breakout sessions. Then we got 2 blocks of them. The first one runs from 9:50 to 10:20, and then we'll have another 10-minute gap. The second one will run from 10:30 to 11. And during each of those blocks, we will present 3 concurrent breakout sessions, and you can access those using the Edge Events conference site. Please see the link in the chat. And you're welcome to change sessions if you start one and realize that you would rather attend a different one. And don't worry if you can't decide which one you would like to choose, because all the presentations will be recorded and posted on the conference landing site and MDHWD website as well. Thank you so much for joining us. We're looking forward to seeing you in the breakouts later on in the day.